A couple years ago, I published this book, What's So Confusing About Grace? And in What's So Confusing About Grace, I told my story of having grown up in a broadly fundagelical tradition and looking for the meaning of salvation and the idea of grace over a span of 40 years. So, fantastic book. My mom loves it, and I explore a lot of theology in it. And I want to use that book now as a launching point to talk about 5 signs that you were also raised fundagelical. Now, what is fundagelicalism? Well, as you can probably guess, it's a portmanteau of 2 words, evangelical and fundamentalist. While the word evangelical has been around in various forms and with various uses since the Reformation period, the modern sense of it emerged in the 1940s as something of a reaction to fundamentalism. So what is fundamentalism? Fundamentalism is a movement that arose in the teens and the 20s of the 20th century, and it was a reaction against what was seen as a growing, incipient liberalism within the Christian church, and particularly the Protestant church in North America. And so those who were fundamentalists, they coalesced around a collection of books, originally booklets called the Fundamentals, which were published by a rich oilman named Lyman Stewart, who commissioned these essays from a range of relatively conservative theologians like James Orr and B.B. Warfield. And they were published in the teens of the 20th century. And by the 1920s, with the Scopes monkey trial in 1925, fundamentalism kind of took off and became its own countercultural movement. They pulled out of the universities and the secularized seminaries in the universities as they were perceived. So for example, Westminster Seminary, I wouldn't necessarily call that fundamentalist, but they did pull out of Princeton and started their own institution. The Bible College movement began in the 1920s, so places like the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, which we know today as Biola University, they all started back in this period, and that was fundamentalism. It was a countercultural movement. It was tended to be anti-intellectual, and they were very much standing opposed to the wider quote-unquote secular culture. Well, in the 1940s, some conservative Protestants were feeling alienated by fundamentalism and thought, well, it's too anti-intellectual, countercultural. And so people like Carl Henry and later on Billy Graham as well began to spearhead the movement of a new, more culturally engaged and intellectually sophisticated evangelical movement, which was meant to be a conservative Protestant view that kind of had the golden mean between the liberals and the fundamentalists. Well, throughout the late 20th century, fundamentalism and evangelicalism continued to grow alongside one another, but like a horse and a donkey, there was some interbreeding, and fundagelicalism, you could say, is the mule that resulted. And I would say that I was raised a fundagelical. So a lot of great things I would say about fundagelicalism. I'm going to kind of look at some of the other aspects of it. Well, some of the great things, I mean, I'll just say that certainly they were very strong and particular doctrines, right? So, and they were worried about some of the cultural accommodation of the liberal tradition, and that's all fine, well and good. But in this video, I want to look at 5 other signs that you were raised fundagelical. Let's dive in with number 5. You spent as much time defending Noah's Ark as Jesus' resurrection. Now, this is especially if you were into apologetics, as I was back in the 1980s. I remember reading a book by Josh McDowell, co-authored with some other bloke whose name I forget, and there was this big discussion in there about defending the historicity of Noah's Ark. And they actually included within the book satellite footage, allegedly, of Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat, or some satellite footage that showed the outlines of what appeared to be an ark in a glacier on Mount Ararat. And they included anecdotal stories of mountain climbers in the mid-20th century who had ascended Mount Ararat and had descended once again with pieces of gopher wood that they had extracted from the ice. And so this was evidence for the historicity of Noah's Ark. Now, where does this idea come from that Noah's Ark is as important as Jesus' resurrection? Because I will say that the Christian gospel is based on Golgotha, right? The rock on which Christ was crucified. It is not based upon Mount Ararat. So where does this idea come from? Well, it comes from this idea from fundagelicalism that if you give up anything in terms of a literal interpretation of any historical claim within the Bible, then really it's kind of like the whole thing's going to fall like a house of cards, or you just keep pulling that thread and the whole sweater unravels. And so to doubt or question the historicity of Noah's Ark and a global flood was as much a threat for the Fundagelical to Orthodox Christian theology as rejecting the very resurrection and crucifixion of Jesus itself. I think that's wrong today. I think that, in fact, Christianity is based on the historical death and resurrection of Jesus, not on Noah's Ark. And people can reasonably disagree about how to interpret or understand Noah's Ark without disagreeing where they should have, I think, unanimity about the resurrection of Jesus if they are Christians. But Fundagelicals would beg to differ. So that's the fifth sign. Now let's turn to the fourth sign. The fourth hallmark that you were raised Fundagelical, you thought about everything in black and white categories. This idea is kind of captured for me when I was watching television in the mid-1980s, and Stryper was coming to town. Stryper was the Christian heavy metal band that was popular at the time, and I believe I was actually in Seattle. We lived in British Columbia, and we got the Seattle TV station, so they were interviewing concert goers lining up for this Christian heavy metal band's concert. And this one concert goer said to the reporter, "Hey man, if you're not singing for God, you're singing for the devil." As if you are either a Christian who is quote unquote singing for God, or you are singing for Satan. Even if you are Crystal Gale or the Carpenters singing, "We've only just begun." Even the Carpenters, Karen Carpenter, was singing for Satan because she was not singing for God. And this is the kind of black and white way of viewing the world that is typical of Fundagelicalism. Fundagelicals tend to gravitate toward the binary language in the Gospel of John, where Jesus often talks about people of the lie and people of truth, people of darkness and people of light. And of course, they always view themselves as the people of light and truth, and others as people of darkness and the lie. There is a place for that kind of language, of course, and that's why Jesus uses it. But we also have to keep in mind that the world does have shades of gray, and Karen Carpenter is not necessarily singing for Satan just because she's not singing Christian gospel songs. Number 3, you spent your money supporting inferior Christian versions of secular products. Music, again, is a great example of this. So when I was growing up in the 1980s, sometimes I was pressured to destroy my secular music albums. I actually smashed a Beach Boys cassette, which I talk about with some shame in this book. And that was because, I was on the one hand, I was being told, well, of course, the Beach Boys, they're singing about surfing USA and California girls, but if there's only you're singing for God or the devil, then I guess they're singing for the devil. And so I would end up destroying my cassettes. And then I'd feel really bad about it, and I'd go out and buy them again, and then I'd feel bad about that. So what you did then is you go to a Christian bookstore, and they have Christian equivalents of all the secular bands. So in the early 80s, when I really liked ABBA, which I still love today. I love ABBA. And so I went to the Christian bookstore, and we asked, well, what do you have that's like ABBA? And they said, Silverwind is like ABBA. So I got a Silverwind cassette, and okay, it's all right. Okay, but Silverwind is not like ABBA. I have not listened to Silverwind for about 36 years. I still listen to ABBA on a weekly rotation in my Spotify playlist. Because ABBA is excellent, Silverwind is not excellent. And there are many other examples like this. If you liked AC/DC, you were told to get the Christian equivalent Ex-Sinner. If you liked Iron Maiden, well, then you were told to get the Christian equivalent Barren Cross. If you liked Queensryche, Christians have Sacred Warrior. If you liked Rat, Christians have White Cross. If you liked Heart, Christians have Margaret Becker. Now, some of these artists, these Christian artists, were certainly talented. White Cross, for example, they had a lot of talent, I think, in their band. But time and again, these bands and artists would present themselves and would be marketed as Christian equivalents of secular artists. And inevitably, the Christian equivalent relative to the secular artist was always inferior, which of course gives an impression that Christian quote-unquote culture is always inferior. This is not exactly Michelangelo, or Bach, or some other great Christian artist. An even worse example, perhaps, of this kind of Christian kitsch or Christian subculture were testaments. Because yes, if you wanted to have fresh breath, secular people used certs or lifesavers, but Christians had testaments. That's fundagelicalism. Let's move on to number two. Number two, your ethic was focused on what you don't do. So rather than focus on the positive idea of a Christian ethic, which is foundationally motivated by the love of God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and the love of your neighbor as yourself, you instead focused inordinately on the things you don't do. You don't drink alcohol, you don't smoke tobacco, you don't have sex before marriage. And so Christians become known for all the, or evangelicals become known for all the things that they don't do, right? That they don't use alcohol, they don't smoke, they don't have abortions because, you know, that's evil. You don't look at pornography, you don't have sex before marriage, and it is wholly defined in a negative sense. Even to the point where I think Mark Twain, who of course lived before the Fundagelicals came around, but he has this comment, one of his quips was, "Sin while you can now, because in heaven it will not be allowed." Something to that effect. In other words, heaven is just manifested by a series of all the things you can't do, so enjoy yourself now. And really, that's kind of the impression that Fundagelicalism sometimes gave about the Christian ethical life. Not that it was a life of fulfillment of being, but rather it was a life of negation of all the things you couldn't do. And this brings us to our number one. You were sure Jesus was going to come back in your lifetime. Huge. Now, a big piece of Fundagelical to talk about now, but I will say it is characterized by a very literal approach to biblical prophecy, by maintaining a distinction in prophecy between Israel and the church, so a fulfillment of one prophecy or the other. So for example, the prophecy in Ezekiel about the restoration of the temple is for a dispensationalist to be understood literally, that the temple in Jerusalem will literally be restored in the future, which of course, because where the temple is supposed to be restored is currently a great Muslim mosque. So this is where geopolitics runs straight into conservative Bible prophecy interpretation. And that, of course, creates no shortage of issues. But one of the big hallmarks of dispensationalism was to predict the end of the world and to try to map out the end of the world. So Hal Lindsey, who I grew up reading in the 1970s, his book, The Late Great Planet Earth, was one of the biggest selling books of the 1970s, predicted the imminent end of the world. I think that Hal Lindsey's basic timeline was that if Israel was founded as a modern nation state in 1948, Jesus should come back within one generation of that. So in the early 80s, the mid 80s, we were like living in imminent expectation of the end of the world. I actually had a friend who went to Bible camp in the late 1970s as a young teenager, and they heard one of these end times preachers speak at Bible camp, and they all went back to their cabin scared that they wouldn't live long enough on earth in order to grow up, get married, and have sex for the first time. They didn't want to be raptured by Jesus before they could experience conjugal relations with their future wife. That's how imminent the end expectation was for Fundagelicals. I had a similar experience growing up some years later in the late 1980s. I actually had a friend named Sean, and in September of 1988, Sean's parents were inspired by a fellow named Edgar Weisnant, who wrote a book, 88 Reasons Why Jesus Will Return in 1988. And Edgar Weisnant predicted that Jesus would return in 1988. And I think he pegged it at like September. So at the beginning of the school year in September 1988, I remember that everyone was talking that Sean's parents had given away and sold off all their possessions with the belief that Jesus would return that month, which he did not. Amazingly, Edgar Weisnant published a new version of the book, 88 Reasons Why Jesus Will Return in 1988, but the next year, titled 89 Reasons Why Jesus Will Return in 89. I actually believed for a while that I would not live to grow old on earth. I would be raptured. I was pretty sure of that. Gradually, as I moved into the early 90s, I came to that existential realization that I will die someday. Maybe sooner, maybe later. Hopefully I will grow old and die rather than be killed in a motorcycle accident or something else. But I will grow old and die. And that was really the first time that I had to struggle with and face the reality of my own mortality. That's one of the things that Fundagelicalism keeps you from. Sometimes facing the imminent reality of your own mortality. It keeps you, as I've said, from facing the grays in the blacks and whites that you've used to structure your world. One more thing I want to add, a runner-up for the top reasons to know, signs to know that you were raised fundagelical. There was a time when you thought that you'd been left behind, that the rapture had happened and all God's true Christians had been taken away and you'd been left behind. And this happened to me when I was a teenager, well, probably around 11 or 12 years old. I woke up from a nap on the couch. I called up for my parents. They weren't around. My brother wasn't around. And for about 15 to 20 minutes, I believed the end of the world was coming. The tribulation was about to unfold and I had been left behind until I found the three of them sitting in the backyard. So fundagelicalism, among other things, often created a kind of not only a black and white view of reality, a denial of your own mortality, an inability to find God outside of the channels of the Christian church, thought that everybody that's not for you explicitly as part of your community is against you. It also often created a lot of fear. I am happy and thankful for certain aspects of fundagelicalism, not so much for these ones, however, and that, to sum up, concludes my top 5 reasons, signs to know that you too were raised fundagelical.